Hello and welcome to the Freedom Anarchist News Review. With me tonight I have Andy Micah. Hello, Andy.
Hello, everyone.
And obviously tonight we are talking about the budget and the many interesting tweaks, minor tweaks, which have been made to the budget by Rachel Reeves, including but not limited to um, the child benefit cap being dropped, a small minimum wage rise, small mansion tax and tax increase for landlords, trains fares being frozen, the triple lock on pensions being kept, um, and then sort of moving down the good news, except in a very small way, bar. We've got dividend tax going up slightly, freeze on tax thresholds, tweaks against savings, vice taxes going up, so you know you're drinking and you're smoking. Tax on electric cars, and an opening up of oil exploration a little bit further. And later we'll be talking about the first big trial of the Filton 24, specifically six members at Woolwich Crown Court in London, including Zoe Rogers, Fatima Zainab, Ray Rajwani, Jordan Devlin, Samuel Corner, and Charlotte Lottie Head. We will round off with talking about a little bit about the Telegraph and its likely buying out by the Daily Mail, subject obviously to the Competition Commission, and Antifa being designated a domestic terrorist organization in the US under National Security Presidential Memorandum 7, along with four groups in Europe being labeled by the State Department as specially designated global terrorists. All very exciting. So, starting off with the budget. What do you reckon, Andy?
Well, it's a cop-out budget, isn't it? As you say, mostly it's lots of little tweaks to throw very small bones to fussy dogs, and reliant on fiscal drag by the freezing of income tax thresholds. It's always a risky one because if incomes simply don't go up, then the drag doesn't produce anything. If the economy continues to go nowhere, then she will be back with the begging bowl next year, which um, looks likely because there are lots of things in the pipeline. One, any unforeseen things that may go wrong, but there's also the 5% defense pledge to Trump. That's impossible under the current financial scheme. And there may be other um, things that, if they want to carry out any reforms, and we'll come to one of those later, that they simply can't pay for the changes in order to improve or make things worse. So for the moment, I think she's patched the ship as well as she possibly can without the blatant breaking of the manifesto promises not to stick up the major taxes. But everyone knows the taxes have gone up. It's certainly not going to get Labour out the hole that they're in. Um, it's a hang on and pray Mr. McCorber like that something turns up budget.
Yeah, I mean, it's as with so much of this stuff, it's the neoliberal core of it is there for anyone to see. And obviously, you've got the Greens, or Zach Polanski has been doing the kind of standard kind of socialist case against it and all the rest of it. Um, in a way, it's nice that the socialist case is actually out there a little bit more, I suppose, or at least the left economic case, if you like. Um, I mean, there is just a fundamental issue that as long as you follow standard economic diktat, most of the measures that they've announced are things which you could probably predict in one form or another. It is, what not to stretch cliches, but it's very much rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. From a for if you were to take kind of Marxisty, communisty point of view, and you're talking about, well, this is a fundamental crisis of capitalism that's happening globally, which is creating the same kinds of outcomes everywhere. Um, and simultaneous to that, you've got the kind of the biggest fish internationally, the US and China. Are leveraging their greater power to bully countries like the UK, and obviously Europe as well is doing the same thing. And it means that the UK is having wealth drawn out of it during a capitalist crisis, which means that any chancellor would have the same basic problems that Rachel Reeves does. And this is it's what makes all of the comment that comes afterwards. Like the response by Kemi Badenoch, for example, who, interestingly enough, uniquely, in fact, for a chancellor's budget, had an actual copy of the budget which he was able to look at shortly the before the budget. It's kind of rinse and repeat. It's just a sort of low detail, high on rhetoric kind of response, saying, well, the Labour is taxing too much and it's spending too much on welfare. And it's like, okay, so, and Reform are coming up with vaguely similar statements. And it's all very much in the kind of, well, we think slightly more money over here rather than slightly more money here might do better for the economy. But ultimately, not a single one of the responses in that budget had anything to do with, what the left likes to talk about in terms of a long-term restoration of sort of Britain's fiscal position on an international basis. Now, obviously, uh, from a more radical economic perspective, it I think there probably are measures which you could use, which would make Britain more capable within the situation it finds itself in, and things like it's good, quite obviously sort of energy and utilities are an obvious are a case where privatization has done a lot of damage. Nationalization with minimal to no compensation would help set that right if you then uh, worked it in with a really decent kind of rejuvenation plan that involved massive investment and an understanding of exactly how all of these things are possible, but they're all within the same general framework of declining wherewithal in a capitalist society, which is suffering from an economic crisis that is not of Britain's making or solvable by the British state, I think. Um, there's this conceit that the British state has an ability to fix issues which are actually well beyond uh, its aegis. It's it doesn't haven't hasn't got those levers to pull. And even if it was in a much better position, it would still be a position where money is slowly flowing out of the economy to rentier capital. Things like Blackstone and sort of PayPal and all of the big companies which have that ability to own all of our national assets or all the private companies within Britain and then suck money out of them. There's really, I don't think that a chancellor, certainly of Reeves's caliber, is capable of squaring that circle. Um, and I don't think that anything short of a very radical um, political entity, and I don't mean a political party by that, because I don't think that any individual political party would be able to carry through uh, something so anti-capitalist, I suppose. Um, yeah, you end up with just this endless kind of every year we go through the same thing of, oh, there's another crisis, and oh, we've run out of money again, and oh, how are we going to raise that extra capital? But the same thing was happening to the Tories before it was happening to Labour, and it would happen to Reform should Reform take power. Just
Yeah,
doesn't seem to
that's
get any
you,
into this anything. Sorry.
if you spend 40 years training to become either a Chancellor of the Exchequer or the captain of the Titanic, you're not going to suddenly think, "Oh, I'll just change direction straight away as soon as I'm in charge of it." There's been icebergs for years. No one's hit them. We'll be fine. Never mind what the stupid lookouts are saying. What do they know? Um, and yeah, another big plug for anarchism. You do need radical root and branch reform to get to the genuine economic problems of not enough people producing useful things and far too many people working on stuff that's of no help to anyone. The other interesting thing to me is the leak from the Office of Budget Responsibility, which is shows the responsible nature. But really, it's a massive blow again for the government because it looks like they are incapable of making anyone do what they say. Um, a bit like the prison release one, the government ministers must have gone around immediately after that saying, "Don't let any more people out of jail that shouldn't be." And what happens? They're just let out. No one is actually scared of the consequences of doing anything wrong. And instead of hearing that people are being fired almost instantly for this, there's going to be some sort of real slow inquiry and nothing will happen, which just lends the feeling that the government's completely impotent about being able to get any of its policies put through, let alone choosing the right ones to start with.
Yeah, no, it's like there's always a thing with budgets, I think, where again from an anarchist perspective, we're sort of just sitting. There's a certain sitting there on the outside, um, because our solutions are not. They generally don't involve sort of these uh, attempts at pulling economic levers and moving a little bit of money here and there from the state, and tend to focus much more on, okay, so macroeconomics, broad economics is pushing society in this direction. And as a society, as groupings within this society, what is our response to that? How do we um, react and adapt to these changes which are happening? Um, I think it can sometimes come across as a little, a little wishy-washy. And obviously, this is something which the Leninists tell us off for all the time, is not having a political program in which we can say, all right, so we're going to take over the state and then use state money to do this, this, and that. But the it I would strongly argue that it's the lack of having a grassroots program that has been doing, I mean, certainly across the left, an inability to consider, all right, so how do we reach out? How do we get into these areas of Britain which have so little resilience? You know, primarily post Thatcher. Obviously, it's our favorite fallback period in those terms. But once the working class had been broken in these areas, the left really had nothing to say to it because it was so reliant on what is the state going to do for these areas, and the state was going to do nothing. So rather than go into them and say, okay, so how do we make uh, these left behind towns, these places which currently, like one of the main complaints that the Tories have, for example, is that there is a huge welfare bill, right? Like particularly for mental health reasons and for physical disability reasons and for age-related reasons. Um, and there's not a lot you can do about physical disability other than fund it better and try and make sure you've got a more resilient population, which is using mutual aid to help each other, which is something the state simply can't do, right? The state can't just say, um, right now, this village is going to have all of you are going to help Mildred down the road who can't walk properly, right? That's something that is 100% reliant on a sense of grassroots solidarity and mutual aid, which means that the only response the state has is to shell out large sums of money to pay someone to do that sort of job. And the the more you know, like it's this classic thing of if you if you wait until someone is very ill and then you start to try and do all the medical things to fix them, it's very, very expensive because they're already very ill and you need all kinds of extra stuff to work with. If you get them when they are early in the process and you can catch it at the right time and you've got everything in place for that, then it can be much, much cheaper just to make sure that they don't get ill in the first place or, you know, aren't ill for very long. In economic terms, you've got this situation where post Thatcher, you have a 30-year decline across towns and cities all across Britain, and obviously in the countryside as well, about which is very little is done. And you allow communities to fracture and become more and more alienated and isolated from one another. And lo and behold, in the mid 2020s, we're in a situation where mental illness and people being unable to care for each other is absolutely endemic to society. And it's very, very expensive for the state to try and do a paid system which allows people to survive and subsist or exist in these towns. Whereas if you'd had from the start a functional mutual aid based society with strong community links, with, you know, I mean, if you wanted the state to do something, the promotion of local, as you say, sort of local resilient businesses, which are all, you know, not giant out of town big box chains and Amazon and all the rest of it. Like that's a genuine like state-led economic process that could have been done and wasn't. But all of these things would have built communities which would have been self-reliant rather than the state having to shell out billions and billions and billions of pounds. Um, and none of this ever gets into the, you know, mainstream media or into discussions about how do we run society better? Because no one thinks in those terms. It is kind of just the anarchists that consistently bang on about this stuff. And on a much more grassroots level, people who work in community centres and sometimes in churches, actually, people who do have that kind of uh, urge to go and help people who are next door or a few doors away. Those are the ones who have been fighting that battle, and they just don't get the public say or noticed. They're too little. You know, the grassroots are just not important enough to have that level of care and attention given to them. We have a few comments actually. Oh, cover. Um, so we have a comment. Lenin subordinated the factory committees, the grassroots movement via the unions when the factory committees were on the verge of making their own national organisation. Wonder how much better it could have been if Lenin hadn't messed with the worker-led movement. I mean, yeah, another good example. There is a fundamental of state control, as we know, and is our fundament. It's one of our core analyses that says, yeah, like centralization, the consistent lack of faith in the public that the state is supposedly trying to serve, consistently makes these things harder to do. Like Lenin and everyone after him were trying to push a particular economic form and a particular dedication to raising the economy of the USSR, which relied heavily on community activity and community, a sense of community ownership of what was going on. But at the same time, you know, they were they took all the power away, all the say was taken away, and in fact, anybody, as we know, who was too aggressive about trying to take that say back, swiftly found themselves either Kronstadted or put in what was it, the Gulag Archipelago? Not a great book, but a great title. Um, Family Soup says lack of class consciousness is the issue. Disabled, homeless, and unemployed people are still working class, and until general society understands that, there will never be equity for these people. I mean, absolutely, yeah. Um, so, do we? We've got one more. The imagination gets weighed down by the lead blanket of capitalism, and we are coached to see capitalism as the air we breathe. All fantastic points. Thank you for all of those. Um, yeah, like we are, I think, very much stuck in in a historic point. I think we are very much stuck in a capitalism which is now so psychologically hegemonic, that getting people to think in other ways is actively becoming more and more difficult. Even on the left, actually, everybody is tending to think in capitalistic ways, and some of these actually are the belated rolling back of the state itself is partially responsible. So, for example, um, when I was just getting started in politics, there was the dole. It was already somewhat restricted, but the dole was something which people could stay on for a while, and whilst they were on the dole, like it was always a uh, disgustingly unfair uh, media portrayal of the Dolly as someone who was just kind of sitting on their ass watching TV on the sofa, whereas in fact, large, there's always some, sure, but a very large percentage of people who were on the dole were out doing other things, right? Like they were helping in the community centres, they were, going shopping for their next door neighbour who was a bit ill, they were taking someone down the bingo of a Friday night. Um, and when the dole was removed, all of that community activity ceased, right? And we now have a situation where really the only people who have the kind of time and energy and uh, wherewithal to do that kind of volunteering are retirees, and people who don't need to work because they have lots of money, which changes the nature of volunteering, what it can achieve, what it intends, and how it's perceived by society. Um, so yeah, so you have this kind of everything. So what happens after that, of course, is that even freedom press, we used to rely not entirely, like it was always a bit hit and miss because voluntarism is always a bit hit and miss, but in the 80s, sort of essentially from the post-war period through to the the 2000s, the vast majority of what happened at Freedom was entirely voluntaristic, and at points it was no one was being paid. Uh, we did come to the conclusion eventually that if you're trying to run something which is essentially a full-time job, you cannot afford to do that and also be unemployed because the unemployment system is now that difficult. So we have part-time workers in the bookshop. Um, and that was essentially the only way in which we could make sure that the admin got done and the books all got ordered and that everything, volunteers were organized and everything runs properly. And I think that the state's withdrawal of services has a little bit to do with that. So even small businesses, in fact, are impacted on those grounds. Um,
But yeah, that's a very interesting example because I was one of the first beneficiaries of being paid at Freedom, and one of the things for somewhere like Freedom is, of course, if you have it run constantly by people who've got spare money or retired, you tend to get a very different class of people who are doing it. And I think you can attribute a lot of the of freedom's drift into moderation in the 50s through to 2000, because it required people who were basically not at the um, uh, shall we say, the cutting edge of political activity. There were people who could afford to put money in and have a nice, quiet life. So it has its problems, but the problems of pure volunteerism are also a difficulty. Um,
Absolutely. Right, shall we move on to our next topic, which I believe is the Filton 24, or at least six of them. So this is the trial of the six members, which is opened in London as of Monday and is presumably ongoing.
It is. It's not ongoing today. It's not ongoing till Friday because, as often happens in these things, various of the lawyers have other commitments. It's just part of the reason that it's scheduled for the 6 to 8 weeks, probably 10 weeks actually, going into January. It looks like, and that may slip. So it's back on Friday. Um, Basically the first six people are those who were actually arrested at the time in the factory, and then there's looking like another three trials for people that the prosecution says were somehow supporting, arranging, conspiring to do the same. There is a very good daily update from Real News, who have people at court reporting in a fair and accurate way. He's just said on the proceedings. I won't speculate too much on it because, of course, there is such a thing um, as strict liability contempt and prejudicing procedures because it is a jury trial, and suggesting anything about the facts could possibly get us into trouble, but I don't think we need to. Um, there is reasonable reports of what is happening, so we just all cross our fingers and hope that the good burghers of London, because although it's Woolwich, because of the sort of trial it is, it will get a jury from across the London catchment area. Um, as a terrorist trial that traditionally would be done at the Old Bailey, but it's done at Woolwich because they don't want large crowds outside the Old Bailey every day. And of course, Woolwich is a high security court right next to Belmarsh Prison. There is, in fact, a tunnel between the two so that they can take people away without even have to put them in the vans. And so it's a very horrible place to actually go to if you never been down there. So we wish them all the best of luck, and we see what will happen. But it does nicely lead us into our good friend Mr. Lammy, who has made a radical proposal for saving the country a great deal of expense by getting rid of juries in all but the most serious cases, which initially seems to be suggesting murder, manslaughter, and rape. The strange thing being is that those are, particularly rape, the one sort of case that you could make a decent argument for juries being prejudiced and not returning a correct verdict. So that's a little bit strange, but the main aim is to save money, because having lots of very hard to tell how real a proposal this is. It comes from a report by former Lord Justice Leveson, which came out in July, suggesting that a lot of cases could be done in judge only, but much lower levels. He was thinking stuff for which you would not be looking at more than a 3-year sentence. At the moment, you can opt for a jury trial if you're risking more than a 6-month sentence. but you can still be jailed in the magistrates for things that do not carry a matter. So it's not like everyone has got a right to a jury trial. I seem to think, and we will not get definite proposals from the government until early next year, that they are floating this one to see how serious the reaction is, because obviously there is opposition from us. There is opposition, strangely enough, from the freedom-loving far right, because it's against British traditions and that. And there is, of course, a
Might
massive
actually affect them once in
establishment.
a while.
And there's establishment like that because it affects lawyers, and it will, and a huge amount of people in Parliament used to be lawyers, including Mr. Lammy, who may be drawing the drawbridge up after them, but traditionally, one of the reasons that the whole system has slowed down is that the amount of complexity in the legal system is continually being increased by more and more detailed laws, which requires more and more lawyers to be paid to try and sort it out. So there are other ways of approaching the saving money aspects, but simply getting rid of juries for things will not solve the backlog at the moment, because there is also a crisis in getting enough judges, in getting defense lawyers, or because it just doesn't pay, for getting prosecution lawyers, because, to use our famous example, there are four types of lawyers. Lawyers can be nice people or nasty people. They can be clever people or stupid people, just like the rest of us. Now, good, nice people who are clever, yeah, they do criminal defence, and they work for nice firms or barristers' chambers and try to help people like us. Your average lawyer who's a nice enough sort of person, but a bit dim, they work on writing people's wills and doing conveyancing and lead a pleasant life. Evil and clever lawyers go and get a load of money working in the city. That leaves only stupid and evil ones to fill the jobs in the Crown Prosecution Service. And one of the reasons they are so bad is that it's filled with incompetent and useless people, because the bright ones are going and getting money in the city, and the virtuous ones won't touch it with a barge pole. It's problems that are fundamental to the system. It will not make the cops be able to deliver disclosure and evidence on time, because they will remain stupid. Because if you have a job that simply attracts people who enjoy violence, then they're unlikely to be razor sharp on civil liberties and procedure. So difficult to tell how it's going. I think they're floating it. They'll see how bad the reaction is. They'll cut it back and then try to get something through. But there's our strong hopes that we might be able to affect that. And while we're on the legal update, also in court this week is the Palestine Action prescription judicial review, being heard today and tomorrow, and then with a special session on Tuesday to be heard in secret, because they'll be getting a security briefing from MI5, MI6, etc. on
Oh, to be a fly
how
on that
dangerous
wall.
Palestine. The surprise there is that Mr. Justice Chamberlain was going to hear this, but he got gazumped on Wednesday. Sorry, on Tuesday. They just decided to sack him, and Dame Victoria Sharp, who is president of the Civil Division of the High Court, decided to do it herself with two sidekicks. There is a feeling amongst those representing our side that Mr. Chamberlain was listening too much to the legal arguments and and the incompetence of the government, and has been booted into touch by Dame Vicky. Um, we were never very hopeful on this one, but it means it's being done by a much more senior panel. It might be a shortcut if we get appeals afterwards. They will now almost certainly go straight to the Supreme Court rather than an intermediary step at the Court of Appeal. But yeah, you need to cross extra fingers and toes for that one to see if we're going to get anywhere.
That was a lot of information. One of the questions I did have was, so with the restriction on who qualifies for juries, it sounded to me like that would clout people like climate protesters, like JSO and XR type people, particularly hard because they would fall directly into the zone where they lose um, the jury trial certainly under these proposals, and whether they also might under a reduced set as well, if you see what I mean.
Very much so. The things that people have been done for public nuisance, where people have been getting up to 4 years, in the case of Roger Hallam, that's exactly the category of people getting sentences in that 6 months to say 5 year or perhaps 3 year bracket, which has been the nasty cases. I would say something like Filton, which has got an aggravated burglary and one GBH in there, that would be very unlikely to it's one of the target ones in Lammy's jurisdiction, but those are looking at the getting towards 10-year sentences, and if they're convicted, and I think that in the long run they will hesitate to pull that, because it's not going to be that much. What they're really against is these what are called either way offences, where you have a choice between being tried in the magistrates and tried before a jury. And one of the big things that happened with the last government, they introduced, the multi-year Tory government, is they introduced an offence of assaulting emergency workers with a maximum initially of 1 year, now up to 2 years, which replaced the old assault PC. You might be thinking the emergency workers protected were sort of like nurses and paramedics. No. Turned out that 90% of all arrests for it were for assaults on police officers. Previously, they were done under Section 89 of the Police Act for assaulting a police officer in the course of their duty, and were convicted in magistrates because it was a magistrates only offence. When this new thing came in of assaulting emergency workers, everyone wisely elected to be tried before their peers. Lots of people got off. Lots of people clogged up the system. I was actually in court once where the judge was just exploded. The 10% of our cases are this. They've been done straight away, and the magistrates just got a month and wouldn't be bothering us anymore. And that's the sort of thing that they're trying to do, because there is this constant thing to invent new crimes, to say that you're going to be hard on crime and protecting people like nurses that people are fond of, and in fact the repercussions aren't thought through, because there's very little thinking going into it. There's a lot of what will make a good soundbite for the moment. But yeah, people who throw soup over a painting and get 2 years, they're exactly the people that they want to avoid having their day in front of the 12 good and true. I'm not saying juries are a panacea and then they are the greatest thing alive. Plenty of protesters have been convicted by them. But as one lawyer once said to me, look, it's if you got the choice, it's always better to play Russian roulette than face the firing squad.
That is a cracking line to move on to our next topic from.
Ah,
um, so the next one on our list is the Telegraph, the other paper of record, which is, I think it's fair to say, turned into a completely Fruit Loop outlet these days. Some of their columnists seem to be practically foaming at the mouth as they write. Um, the It's being taken over by everyone's favourite trust, the Daily Mail and General Trust, um, owned of course by Viscount Rothermere, that well-known tax dodger who lives in a completely different country most of the time. Um, the most patriotic of British. Is he a billionaire? I think he might just be 100 millionaire. You know, basically impoverished by today's rich people standards. Um, I thought it was an interesting one to flag, primarily because obviously the Daily Mail has attempted this before and got told off because it was to do with the competition, monopolistic media control. This was a bare 2 years ago that it was being told off on this basis and being told that it couldn't by the Daily Telegraph. Uh, Whereas this year, two years later, it's now saying, well, we think we have a decent uh, changed position in terms of competition because media has moved on, etc., etc. And the government seems to be giving it a sort of serious think, primarily, I suspect, because the Daily Telegraph's um, saga of sort of needing to be sold but not being sold has been rumbling on for, God, I don't even know how long. Since the Barclay brothers ran out of money, which was quite a while ago now. Um, but yeah, like it's possible that the DMGT, hang on, DMGT, yeah, uh, would need to get rid of either the independent, no, is it iNews? I think they own, and or the
ah,
Metro, which are their two liberal outlets, in order to pass by the Competition Commission. Uh, but it would leave ownership of the hard right position, essentially, other than GB News, in pretty much the hands of one guy at this stage. Um, I don't know. What do you think the impact of that would be? I mean, it seems a very neat fit for the Telegraph as is.
yeah, I'm not. Um, I can't say I've followed the Telegraph. How different it is at the moment from the Mail in what it's trying to churn out. I mean, obviously, traditionally it's a broadsheet and it's supposed to be slightly posher audience wise than the Mail, but I don't. I think the argument that they will be putting forward against whatever the Monopolies and Mergers Commission is called these days is that in this digital age, just owning two big newspapers isn't such a big thing as it was in the past. Um, and yeah, the papers sales continue to decline, and their online is difficult for them to compete with newer sources. The I think turn of the 19th century quote about the Daily Mail by office boys for office boys um, still pretty much holds true. It's There's the Express that's not quite as rabid and therefore hasn't got quite as many viewers or readers. in a short while, you think, is there actually going to be room for the two of them if they're owned by the same? And you try to think of amalgamated names like the Daily Tory Graph or the Tory Fail or whatever they can come up with. But yeah, it's I just wish them both as much harm as possible, and and
I'll be interested to see how it all changes. Like I'm a newspaper guy by background, so I'm always interested to see how these things are pottering along. Like one of the things with uh, newspapers in general is that the actual printed physical copy um, is the last 10 years have been absolutely catastrophic in terms of direct sales. Um, I mean, having worked in newspapers and being a newspaper guy, don't get newspapers because you can read them all online, etc., etc. And it does change the way in which these media outlets have to present themselves. So, the Daily Mail's uh, online turn um, made it slightly less political, I think, than when it was a newspaper, because it's trying to be more mainstream and well, it's trying to uh, appeal to a global audience, I suppose, because it considers itself a global outlet. So its tone changes as a result. You can see this quite strong. The left tends to read the Guardian more, and you can see this a lot with the Guardian, right? Is that the Guardian's tone, what it takes notice of, it is much more. It's actually much more America centric than it used to be. I think the Guardian, as a rule. Um, the Daily Telegraph has most of what it's attempted has been quite silly, I think, in as much as the actual content of the Daily Telegraph has always been a bit moustache. It was infamous for being the Colonel moustache twitchy, I'm writing by candlelight type, right? Um, but it wasn't uh, outright weird. It was trying quite hard to be like a respectable broadsheet. Whereas if you look at its online posting, it's gone full on into clickbait as a modern paper to the point where you read some of these headlines and indeed some of the articles, particularly like Suzanne Moore, um, and they are genuinely unhinged. Like they're very difficult to look at without thinking something has gone terribly wrong at this supposed serious media outlet. I think one of the things which will be interesting will be to see if the Mail takes over, whether the Daily Telegraph actually reverts a little bit back to a more uh, respectable approach, because that would be its position within the broader company, I suppose. Still, interesting times for the ever declining mainstream press, uh, of which I think the last time I checked, the only papers that were managing to hold on to their readerships were the FT, because it's such a specialist newspaper, and if you want to read about economics and business, that's what you read, and therefore you have to pay the toll. The Morning Star, because it has an excessively loyal uh, sort of left-wing readership of largely an older demographic, and the Camden New Journal, which has managed, much like Private Eye, actually, has managed to embed itself as kind of a community institution to the point where people just keep buying it, which I thought the Camden New Journal is a very interesting institution on that level. Um, right, which leaves us with rounding off on a Freedom News story, as we always try to, which is Terror as a Strategy of Tension, by Josie, writer Josie. This is a story about Antifa being a designated a domestic terrorist organization by the US, and four groups, including Antifa Ost or Antifa East, I think that's the German grouping, being designated as uh, outright terror organizations. So the US doesn't designate terror organizations on a domestic level, on a domestic basis in the same way as it does on an international basis, but has decided that Antifa is now officially terroristic behavior. Um, it'll be an odd one because, there is no no organized grouping known as Antifa in that sense. So exactly how they're going to put the finger on anybody, no idea. How do you reckon, from a legalistic perspective, what is the deal?
Um, yeah, the antifa, as they insist on pronouncing it, I, it seems to be an invention of the American right, to cover a broad range of things that they don't particularly like. Now, obviously, anti-fascist organisations have been called terrorists in the past, usually by fascists. And certainly, it's about time that the people who ran the Special Operations Executive, or the American equivalent, the OSS, should have been rounded up for all their war crimes, assassinating Nazis and blowing up uh, their stuff. Um, I just don't think it's going to have any immediate effect uh, in Europe on those things. The one thing that obviously in this country we have had a prescription of a direct action group, and it's possible that if the government thinks that this has been a success, they might just do it just to butter Trump up because that's Starmer's whole plan to continue his career traveling around the world to summits, um, being the peacemaker between Trump and anyone who tries to persuade him that he's being a complete nut job. Um, there is a chance, because we're at that time of year, that Starmer will watch Love Actually over Christmas and decide that he may be as strong-willed as Hugh Grant after all. But it looks much more likely that this is just a hot air story. But as with all of this stuff, it's the chilling effect that it has, which I believe Mr. Greenhall was speaking about in the Royal Courts of Justice today in the actual PA case, is that people are now frightened to go and protest against Elbit because they think that they're going to be picked up for this. And if people are getting the impression that being against fascism is somehow a bad thing and that the government is going to arrest people for that, then um, it, it's difficult. I mean, there was a newspaper in the 1930s, and you might remind me of which one of the two it was, that had the headline "Huzzah for the Black Shirts."
That was the Mail.
Um, it was indeed. But yeah, the whole concept that we've gone from that somehow being against fascism or Nazism can be a bad thing is utterly bizarre. Growing up in a country that was had a diet of war films and heroics against
Outright
Nazis.
fetishized the idea of being anti-fascist. Like it's kind of one it became one of the founding myths of kind of modern British life, right? Was the whole we put it all on the line to fight fascism. And now it's like, oh well, maybe you don't fight fascism. That's a bit much. Um, Not what Grandad would have
Bizarre.
wanted at all. I mean, that was always, like I always thought it was an interesting analysis that it crops up on the left. It probably came from someone considerably smarter whose name I don't know. But the idea that uh, the defining of Britain as anti-Nazi and anti-fascist has always been a weakness, in fact, when trying to actively stamp out fascism counterintuitively, because Britain doesn't want to face up to fascist behavior that it engages with because it considers itself beyond or outside the possibility of that happening. So even though we have had many, particularly activities on the international basis, which have been decidedly in the camp of sort of pseudo-fascist or neo-fascist behavior, um, and we've actively we spent years and years backing Franco and um, sort of looking the other way on allies behaving in extremely fascistic ways. Um, but we were always Britain can't be fascist, and now we're getting to the point where even that's breaking down, and you're getting people who are politically very close to fascism who are getting into very senior positions. Like I think Robert Jenrick's not a fascist before any um, before any libel cases get brought. But some of the rhetoric he does, in my view, um, is certainly pushing towards that kind of direction. Like some of his YouTube videos have been absolutely outrageous in terms of the way in which they dehumanize foreigners. They are outright xenophobic in places, plays to a vision of nationalism and our part in it, which is, you know, um, not that long ago would have been considered quite infra dig from a right-wing perspective, even I think. The flagging thing, I think, falls into a similar category. Um, and it's the tone of the discussion online about activity which it draws primarily from US flag shagging more than anything else, I think, but it's the way in which it's put into practice has been primarily led by people who are on the far right to fascist wing of things. And it's been very strongly pushed back against, not just by other fascists, but by people who, not so long ago, I think would have been a little put off or, not sure about this whole putting flags everywhere malarkey. Um, and oh yeah, let the bodies pile high sounded a bit like eugenics. Oh, yeah, arguably so, yeah. Um, yeah, like I think there is a normalization of, if not fascist, ersatz fascist um, tone and edging ideology, I suppose, which is really not being. I think the US's attack on anti-fascism in a way comes later than the UK's because obviously a lot of people got locked up in the wake of the 1990s and 2000s anti-fascist movement. Um, there's been a general crushing of street movements of all kinds, which isn't being applied to the far right at the moment, I think it's fair to say. And obviously today you had not fascists, but in terms of the right giving a general steer as to how it feels about boots on the ground activism from its side. You've had Reform saying it's going to pay for any arrests which happen at the farmers' protests. Now, farmers obviously aren't fascists. What they're protesting is not about fascism. But the fact that Reform is saying outright, we're going to provide money towards defending people who are being arrested for protesting on topics we agree with and believe in, is very much a dog whistle and a nod towards when we're in charge, lads, right? It's going to be open season for a certain grouping of people. Um, And yeah, like the left is currently like this whole, it's the two-tier stuff being exactly the reverse of the reality, right? Is that we are already, Britain doesn't have as yet the antifa is terrorist direct association. Although, as you say, it may only be a matter of time and whether Keir Starmer wants to suck up to Trump. But it does have it towards it is already applied it to direct action, destructive direct action, and there's no reason why it couldn't be in the future. Um,
Yeah,
so
bad times are coming.
yeah, so that's ending things on a chirpy note as ever. Um, so we've hit our hour. So thank you very much, Andy, for showing up. Pleasure as always, and excellent legal updating. Thank you everyone for joining us, and indeed for the fantastic conversation in the comments. I was keeping a general eye on it, and we shall see you all next week. Cheerio.
Yeah. Cheers, comrades.